Hi everyone, so welcome back. We're about to get started with Cycle 1, Math, Part A, Getting to Know Your Students. So during this section, it has a whole class section. So it talks about prior knowledge in order for us to continue with our current content that we're about to teach. How do we get there? How do we get prepared, etc. After that, it talks about contextual information of the class. They want to know how many students we have, what grade level, how many students on IEP, how many students do we have on do we have that are English learners, sorry. And then the last section talks about focus students. So we have 3 focus students that we're going to be focusing on throughout this cycle. So the first focus student is a student who is an English learner. Our second focus student is a student who is an IEP, 504 or GATE plan. The third student is a student who is experiencing unexpected life experiences. Maybe someone who just passed, their mom just passed away, or a student who, just has problems emotionally and physically, etc. So this is very private information, but I'll change the students' names and all that. So just to keep it, safe, because these are real students that I talked about. So yeah, as I mentioned before, this section should be simple and easy. So let's get started with it.
Some of these templates have certain requirements, such as page limit. We have to read the directions fully and understand what they're asking for us to do. So for example, some have page limits, so let's not go over that page limit, because we never know what if they deduct points because of that. So let's get started with whole class. Number 1 reads description of students' assets and learning needs. So as we know that assets and learning needs consist of where are students struggling, where are students proficient in. So we need to incorporate that in our lesson. So for example, 1A reads prior academic knowledge related to specific content that you plan to teach. So during this section, we have to talk about how the content that we taught, who knows, last week, 2 weeks ago, is beneficial to the content that we're about to teach. How do those two connect? So for example, in my case, I talked about how I have a 3rd grade class of students who have mastered the California standards for 3rd grade model representation of multiplication and division. My students were required to identify and draw both multiplication and division problems. So by drawing out, I mean, for example, 6 times 20 drawn out would be 6 groups of 20. My students are able to do that. They're able to recognize that. But now we want to go above and beyond. I know there's other ways than just, drawing 6 groups of 20. So that's why, because of that, my students are now going to go deeply into the conversation once we have different methods of drawing this math problem. So then that's whenever my content about to being taught ties into my prior knowledge, because our new content that we're about to being taught talks about how we as educators could perform different ways of representing a multiplication or division problem. By different ways, I mean that we could incorporate arrays, number lines, incorporate manipulatives. So that's what I talked about during that section, and that's what my new content that's about to be taught is going to be. Different ways in which we can represent a multiplication and division problem. So then during that section, I also talked about how students needs were understanding the difference between division and multiplication. Some students would get confused with these terms, and that's very challenging, because without knowing these terms, and they could get our problems wrong, right? Like when solving the problems, it could be very hard for them because they don't know the difference. So they don't know what they're doing. They don't know if they're adding, they don't know if they're subtracting, they don't know if they're multiplying, etc. So I talked about that. So then I also talked about where my students are very, proficient in. I talked about how my students are very good at skip counting. They know how to skip count their 3s, their 5s, their 4s, and all other numbers. So without that, my students, would be struggling once we enter our new content, because we are going to be still working with multiplication and division and all that. So because of them being proficient in that, it's going to allow them to be more beneficial, more knowledgeable. So that's what I talked about. I talked about how they're going to be more knowledgeable, or in their learning needs, how is this going to affect them. So I threw all that and just explain them more deeply. And then for part B, it talks about English language proficiency level, standard English learners and English learners. So during this section, I talked about how my 3rd grade class consists of 26 students. There are 7 students who are identified as English learners. 5 English learners are male, 2 of them are female, ages 8 through 10 years old. So I talked about how many are male and female, as you could hear me from reading that. And then I also talked about how these learners their native language is Spanish, and how 4 out of the 7 students have scored an overall 3 on the LPAC. The other 3 EL learners have scored a 2 on the LPAC. So during this section, you have to go and talk to your teacher, or if you're the teacher, you have to write down their LPAC grades and all that. And then after talking about that, I talked about how students about the students who are standard English learners, and I talked about how there was 18 students who were standard learners. And that's pretty much it for that section. And then if we go down to part C, it talks about cultural and linguistic resources and funds of knowledge. So for example, knowledge and skills driven from culture experience. So during this section, I broke it down and talked about my students' race. So I talked about how my class consists of 26 students, one of them being Asian, one of them being Hispanic, 15 of them being Hispanic, and 7 of them being Caucasian descent. And then providing a cultural diverse student population within the classroom. Sorry about that. So as you can see, I have different students who are Hispanic, Caucasian. I have an Asian student. We have students from different race. So that's very beneficial for all of us, because we could all learn from each other. Then I mentioned how I got to know all this information because of my master teacher. I talked about how all of my students are U.S. citizens born in the United States. But regardless of where they come from, students are very comfortable with working with each other. Students show a huge interest in reading and love hands-on activity. Students celebrate holidays such as Christmas, Easter, New Year's, and much more. So this is information that I got from my funds of knowledge. So depending on what credential program you're on, some of us might do funds of knowledge, some of us might not. But for one of my activities that I had to do a funds of knowledge. With this, I got to learn information from my students. And because of that, now I'm incorporating it into my getting to know my students. And I talked about how because of the funds of knowledge that I did and performed with them, I got to learn all this information. I got to learn that, they speak Spanish, or that they celebrate Cinco de Mayo or Mother's Day, etc. And then I talked about how every student has a unique cultural background, and how we adjust that to our instruction. And most importantly, when students bring their culture and linguistic resources from home, it's extremely beneficial. Once we're in the classroom, students could share their information that they got from being at home. By sharing the information, the students gain a lot of knowledge, So and I also talked about an example of one of my students. So for example, I'm gonna say my student's name is David. I talked about how David is a very curious person, and how David at home did a science project and brought it the next day to school. No one has ever been introduced to photosynthesis since this was at the beginning of the school year. So everyone was curious of what David brought. So this not only brought, engagement in the class, but students were curious. They wanted to learn more about it. So this is how linguistic and cultural background resources and like outside of school activities make the classroom more beneficial and etc. So that's what I talked about during that section. So then for section D, prior experiences and interests related to the content you plan to teach. So I talked about how I am focusing on multiplication and division, and I hope to deliver a lesson in which my students will be able to represent and solve problems regarding multiplication and division. During the opening of my lesson, I will connect my students' prior knowledge of model representation before introducing the new topic. So as you can see, during that section, I talked about my prior experiences because that's what it's telling us. Prior experiences and interests related to the content you plan to teach. So you have to read this very carefully. And then I provided an example, of what I'm about to do. I talked about how I would deliver a question for the class to solve. The question will read, select the visual representation of 5 times 30. And of course, I'm going to have a diagram showing 5 times 30 with different answer choices. And the students are going to, select the correct choice. This will allow my students to be creative and see how they will draw the problem out. Then after that, as we move on into the lesson, I will have students name the different ways we can represent multiplication and division, which now that is my content that I plan to teach. So since it's asking us how is that related to the content we plan to teach, then that's how I'm going to go further and more and then talk about how I related it. So now students are going to be creative since they're going to be, throwing out ways that we could represent multiplication and division. So for example, arrays, number line, using manipulatives, etc. Students have very, very different ways that they could do certain things. So then I talked about what my plan is. I mentioned how I plan on making my lesson interesting by incorporating learning resources such as involving the usage of whiteboards and manipulatives so my students can represent the math problems I provide for them. My students love to use the whiteboard and draw, and therefore this will be a great way to have them engage in the lesson. This I mentioned because it's very important because it talks about interest. It's asking about interest. If we read the question again, it says prior experiences and interests related to the content you plan to teach. I talked about how because my students love to use their whiteboard and love to draw, I'm going to incorporate that into my current content. So I'm going to be asking them, could you show me how we would represent the question, the problem 5 times 20, and they're going to, draw it out and then show me. So that's how I'm incorporating the interest. Because, whenever students are very, very passionate about something and then we incorporate it into our lesson, they're going to be very engaged. So that's what they want to see. So then if we move on to contextual information over the class, this is very simple. What grade level, 3rd grade. I just left out this from my previous TPA. So grade level, 3rd grade, age of students. The range is from 8 to 10 years old. What content area I plan on doing. So math, operations, and algebraic thinking. Interpret products of whole numbers. And then structural studying. Is it in person, online, hybrid, whatever. And then the resources and materials. And then I just wrote in regards to my lesson, the multiplication and division, the resources that we're using is Canva to create a PowerPoint that I will use throughout my lesson. Materials involved will be whiteboard, dry erase marker, and Unifix cubes. And then my total number of students, the total number of students in the whole class, number of students identified as English learners, number of students as standard English learners, number of students who are on an IEP, number of students who are on a 504 plan, and the students who are gay. And then if we go on, it talks about students like what dual setting you're on. In this case, that didn't apply to me because, you know, I'm not in a dual language setting. So I just left that blank. I just put not applicable, NA. So then if we go on, we have focus students. And it says description of 3 focus students, assets, and learning needs. And then this is talking to us about how we need to select 3 students that we need to talk about throughout this lesson. Those 3 students that we are going to be mainly focusing on. Our first focus student, as I mentioned, needs to be an English learner. And then for focus student 1, we have our question A. It says currently proficiency reading, writing, and speaking / listening in English and mastery of the primary language. So during this section, I talked about how focus student 1 is Hispanic. He was born in the United States, but English was not his first language. And I talked about how his native language is Spanish. He tested by the LPAC, and he scored an overall score of 2 for reading and writing, as well as listening. So this information I got from my master teacher. We went through every student. We talked about how, what assessment they did in order to receive a grade. And in this case, it was an LPAC. And then for part B, it says prior academic knowledge relating to specific content you plan to teach. So, focus student 1 is familiar with the topic of finding different strategies to represent or solve multiplication and division. Because previously we worked on this on model representation for multiplication and division. So he already knows that background knowledge. Then I talked about how my students worked on addition and subtracting constantly, so that is helping him, with the content that is going to be taught. So he has that little background knowledge, and this is going to be beneficial for him because we are going to be talking about addition and subtraction. Then if we go on to letter C, it talks about social identity. So how students express self-concept driven from social group that is evident through peer or adult interactions inside or outside school. I talked about how my student is. So focus student 1 is a shy person. Besides being close to his certain friends, how some students are very shy but are very, very talkative with their best friends. So I mentioned that. I talked about how he's very good with friends and gets along with other people. I've seen him play, work, and help others. And focus student 1 is surrounded by very great individuals both at school and outside school, because that reflects from his behavior at school. That's what I mentioned, because if we read the question again, it talks about inside and outside of school. This person is a student who is very well behaved, and that shows because there's times where students have problems at school because maybe at home they're going through something. Then I talked about how he's a very hardworking student, although there's times where he really has challenges. He overcomes them. He gives his all to his academic work because he tries to do everything in order for him to understand something. So that's what we have to do during that section. Just talk about his social identity and how he is, how he's with, how social is he, etc. Then we have part D. It's cultural, linguistic resources, and funds of knowledge. So I talked about how focus student 1 attends an English school where the school language setting is English. I talked about how he comes from a Hispanic household, and he is the only child and will be first generation from his from his family. And how do I know this? I know this because, again, I did a funds of knowledge at the beginning of the school where I got to learn a lot of information from students. So this is very, very helpful for you to do if you're about to, like, enter the school year with the grade level. Do a funds of knowledge because you will need to, like, incorporate a lot of personal information into your focus students. I also talked about how focus students' needs and interests are how I know his needs and interests because I also provided a survey called Interests and Attitudes where I met with him one-on-one to build personal relationship. For this survey, I found out that focus student 1 loves being curious on Google Earth. He enjoys reading biography books, and his favorite holiday is Christmas. I also learned how he feels about certain things both in school and out of school. Then, if we move on to part E, it talks about prior experiences and interests as they relate to the content you plan to teach. So during this section, I mentioned how Focus Student 1 prior experiences with multiplication and division is being involved in Freckle Math. So Freckle Math is a program for certain students who are slightly behind in math or have or struggle with math, and how he receives the extra assistance with math. In Freckle Math, they focus and help students in all areas such as multiplication, addition, area, perimeter. So not just does he have background information, but he has additional resources to help him with the content that's about to be taught. Then I also mentioned how he loves viewing images on Google. So sometimes if we talk about a certain topic, we were talking about spiders, and then we broke down the different type of spiders that there is, and then he wanted to see the other different type of spiders that there was, since the only one he knows is the tarantula, and how it's a black spider and has 8 legs and all that, but he wanted to see the different other spiders, so he loves searching images up. And then I talked about how being an English learner is challenging for him because he uses Google in order for him to visually see what that item or what that topic or what we're talking about is. He wants to visually see something in order for him to understand it better. And I mentioned how my student also struggles with vocabulary, and for my lesson we will have challenging words such as product and dividend, and sometimes he might not know what those words are. So then because of that, I plan on incorporating his interest of images and incorporating it into my lesson to introduce vocabulary that is going to be taught in my lesson. And I talk about this because as it's asking us about our students' interest. My student loves Google Earth. He loves viewing images or videos, and as I mentioned, he struggles with certain vocabulary words. So I could introduce my vocabulary words by incorporating images in order for him to see a visual representation, and his love for images is presented throughout my lesson because he's able to physically and visually see him. If we move on to part F, it talks about how developmental considerations, so social, emotional, typical, atypical. So we have to talk about if they're atypical or typical students. And then for this section, I talked about how after having a conversation one-on-one with my master teacher, I got to understand that focus student 1 is best. He's best by being alone sometimes, and he does not have any developmental considerations. So this is personal information that you should talk to about your master teacher if you're a student teacher, or if you're the teacher, then you already know this information. And then we have part G, ELD learning goal. So this section is very, very, very I guess, challenging, because we have to be very specific in this section. We have to try our best, because this is one of the main things that our graders look at. And if we don't know how to write a ELD goal, then we do get points deducted. So if you want to see another video of me just explaining how to properly write an ELD goal from the best of my knowledge, again, I'm not a professional, but this is how I did this. And I did a lot of research, so I could show you how to write a ELD goal properly. So if you would like another video on ELD goal, you could let me know down in the comments. So then if we move on for focus student 2, again, the student is either a student on a 504, IEP, or a GATE. So I talked about how my focus student for learning 1, I talked about how my student has a speech and language problem. He has trouble communicating with adults as well as his classmates. We incorporate sentence frames to help focus student out. He has speech instruction where he gets pulled out during class to receive extra assistance and hopes to become verbally active. And this will help him be, more engaged in the classroom. I mentioned how the student has to sit in front of the class and always has to have a partner next to him because he tends to forget instruction very quickly. So the partner helps the student by reminding him or, repeating. There's a lot of repetition with the student. He also has very little work to do because of his speech and language problem. There isn't as much academic work for him to do compared to other students. Then if we move to part B, prior academic knowledge. So this is the same thing. What prior academic knowledge do we have that is going to be beneficial to the student? So this section is very similar to the section above for focus student 1. And then same as section C, social identity. How is the student inside and out of school? How is his behavior? Does his behavior perform, from outside? So let's say his parents are struggling. He's very, aggressive sometimes, maybe because his parents are struggling at home. We just have to mention all that, which is the same thing as focus student 1. These are similar questions. Cultural and linguistic resources and fundamental knowledge, the same thing. Prior experiences. So this is pretty much the same thing. And then if we go on to assesstive technologies as appropriate, so like does he need something in particular? So for example, does our student need a computer? Does he always use a computer, or does he always need a whiteboard and a marker? You know how some students might not like paper and pencil, they're strictly on computer. So do they use something? Are they always on something? So on computer, so let's say student doesn't like writing, so he always has to be on Google Docs or Word. So then if we move on to focus student 3, during this section we are going to be talking about someone who is experiencing life experiences either inside or out of school that may result in a need for additional academic or emotional support. So for this section I talked about a student of mine whose parents were not always involved in their lives. The student was taken care of, their grandparents. Their mom was always working. Their dad isn't present in their life. When we have parents who are separated, it's very difficult because mom is always working. She's a single mom. She doesn't work. How's she gonna provide for her daughter? I mean, so it's very challenging when it comes to students like this, and it's very hard. So we as teachers have to understand that they are going through something, and they need our emotional support. They need us there because maybe mom isn't always there, or grandma, even though grandma is their caregiver. Maybe grandma is also struggling with her personal life, etc. I talked about what my student has. I talked about how that's affecting her. And I talked about her needs or what's going on with her. For example, I mentioned how focus student 3 always needs support. She always needs someone next to her. she never wants to do anything unless there's someone next to her. But this is very hard because there's just one teacher versus 30 students. We can't always be there for her, you know what I mean? So that's what I incorporated in that section. Section A, I mean. When it comes to math, she's the only one who uses manipulatives. So she would like seeing things visually. She struggles a lot. She's one of the lowest students that I have in that classroom. That's why I incorporated in there. And I talked about how all this is affecting her emotionally and academically. For example, I talked about her mom not always being there. Maybe her mom doesn't help her with her homework. Maybe that's why she never does her homework. This is affecting her academically because when it comes to school, when it comes to tests, she doesn't know what to do. So you have to connect this information. Then prior academic knowledge related to specific content you plan to teach. So section B, this is the same thing. Prior academic knowledge related to the content we plan to teach. So for example, my student already knows how to do multiplication and division and finding the different strategies to solve this. So this is information that's very similar to for both focus student 1 and 2. The same thing for section C, for section D, and E. And then for section F, it talks about developmental considerations. So during this section, I talked about how focus student 3 seems to be struggling socially and keeping friends. Although it's very hard for her, she seems emotionally happy, which is very, not weird, but different, I guess. And I incorporated that in there. Then I talked about how focus student 3 displays atypical children development because her inability to stay focused and complete classwork like the majority of her classmates. So the student struggles in completing her work. She gets distracted by the simplest things, literally with her hair tie, anything. It's just very hard for her, to stay focused. And I had to mention all that in there. And I also mentioned how my math teacher tried recommending her to be on an IEP, but due to her attendance, it's very bad. And because of her attendance being very bad, the principal or the school environment thinks that her absences are causing her to be this way. But in reality, the absences don't really mean much. It's just her. She has she needs academic support and emotional support. So the absences don't mean anything. So this is the end of part A, getting to know your students. So if you have any other questions, or if you want me to provide more examples or clarify something, just write it down in the comments and I'll reply to you. Thank you.